The story of the 761st Tank Battalion begins long before its tanks ever rolled into the frozen killing grounds of eastern France. It begins in the segregated America of the 1930s, where black soldiers could drive trucks, dig trenches, or cook meals, but commanding a tank, the symbol of modern mechanized power, was considered unthinkable. The U.S. Army of that era believed armored warfare demanded technical intelligence and leadership qualities it refused to associate with African American troops. Yet global war would overturn those assumptions, and the men who would later be called the Black Panthers forced their way into history not through permission, but through performance. In 1942, as the United States expanded its armored forces, pressure from civil rights leaders, black newspapers, and a handful of officers inside the War Department finally resulted in the creation of an all-black tank battalion. It was officially designated the 700th. The Army expected little from it. To many commanders, it was a political concession and experiment, at best. But from the moment the battalion formed at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, its soldiers trained as if every wasted second confirmed the prejudices stacked against them. They learned gunnery, turret drills, radio procedures, and engine maintenance with a focus bordering on obsession. If they failed, the Army would blame their race. If they succeeded, the Army would call it luck. They understood that the burden was heavier on them than on any other armored unit in the country, that their training environment was unforgiving. Segregation shaped every corner of military life. The men faced discrimination at local businesses, insults from white units, and routine denial of resources others received without asking. But the Black Panthers developed a culture of internal discipline, sharper, stricter, more unified than what many white units achieved. Their creed became simple: out-train everyone, outshoot everyone, outfight everyone. They painted a panther's head on their vehicles, not as decoration, but as a warning. By late 1944, the war in Europe had entered its most desperate phase. After the breakout from Normandy and the race across France, Allied momentum slowed. Fuel shortages strangled Patton's Third Army. German forces resisted with growing fanaticism. Weather turned the fields into mud. Casualty lists grew. The U.S. Army needed fresh armored units that could move, punch through defenses, and keep pressure on the retreating Wehrmacht. It needed replacements fast. That urgency opened a door that segregation had kept closed. When General George S. Patton reviewed the 761st in November 1944, he found a unit far better trained than he expected. Patton's reputation as a harsh judge of soldiers was well earned. He did not care about background, politics, or racial debates. His only metric was combat performance. After observing their gunnery and maneuver drills, he issued the line that would forever define the battalion: "I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill the enemy." And with that, he assigned them to his spearhead. The Black Panthers were about to enter the front line in the most brutal season of the European War. Their first combat operation was the Battle of Morville-les-Vic and Vic-sur-Seille in November 1940. Close-range armored engagement in dense fog, minefields, and forested hills where tanks often could not see more than 50 yards ahead. The battalion's M4 Shermans were fast and reliable, but thinly armored compared to the German Panzer IV and the deadly Panther. A Sherman could burn from a single well-placed shot. Yet in their first 48 hours of combat, the men of the 761st demonstrated the discipline forged in Louisiana. They maneuvered aggressively, coordinated with infantry under impossible visibility, and attacked German positions that had stopped white units days earlier. Their baptism of fire came with heavy losses. Tanks were hit by anti-tank guns hidden in barns and behind hedgerows. Panthers engaged them from long distances the Shermans could not match, but the battalion refused to break. Lieutenant Charles Thomas, leading the spearhead, was severely wounded while directing his platoon under fire. Even after shrapnel tore into his body, he continued issuing orders until he collapsed. For that action, he would later receive the Distinguished Service Cross, upgraded decades later to the Medal of Honor. After a review of discrimination-era awards, word spread quickly through Third Army headquarters. The Black Panthers were not simply adequate. They were outperforming expectations and pushing deeper than anyone believed possible. Their aggressive thrust helped open the route toward the Saar region, a critical industrial zone Germany desperately tried to defend. For the first time, the Army began to recognize a reality long invisible by choice. These men were tankers, professionals, equals in the most demanding branch of modern warfare. But their true test had not yet come. Within weeks, the German Army launched its last great offensive of the war, the Ardennes assault that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Patton needed armored units capable of moving in winter mud, breaking through ambushes, and reinforcing collapsing lines. Many commanders doubted that any fresh battalion, especially a segregated one, could survive what lay ahead. Patton disagreed. He sent the 761st directly into the path of the German attack. The battalion rolled north in freezing rain, visibility near zero, tracks skidding on ice, engines straining against the cold. Tank commanders kept their hatches open despite the weather, knowing a closed hatch meant death. If a German infantryman with a Panzerfaust appeared at close range, the Panthers advanced mile by mile, determined not only to hold their sector but to prove something deeper, that their performance under fire would obliterate the myth of racial inferiority that had defined the Army for generations. Their arrival in the Bulge marked the transition from experiment to frontline force. This was no longer about representation or politics. This was survival for them, and for the Allied units depending on their armor to hold the line. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion entered France with a reputation they had not yet been allowed to prove. They were trained longer than most armored units, drilled harder, and inspected more brutally because every failure would be used as evidence that they were unfit to fight. Their officers reminded them daily, one mistake would not be treated as an individual error, but as a collective indictment. In the segregated army of the Second World War, they carried the burden of representing an entire race under an institution that doubted their very presence in combat. Yet once the battalion crossed into the European theater, doubt disappeared, replaced by the cold, methodical focus of armored warfare. Their first engagements under Patton's Third Army came in the Lorraine region, where mud, fog, and German anti-tank ambushes tested every crew. The 761st operated M4 Sherman tanks modified with improved powertrains and winter kits. But the terrain punished machines as much as men. Tracks froze, transmissions locked, and engines stalled unless crews kept them warm through the night. The battalion learned quickly that survival depended on constant maintenance, disciplined communication, and the ability to identify German positions before the Germans identified them. Panther and Tiger tanks could outrange a Sherman, but they could not move as quickly nor reposition with the same agility. The 761st used this disparity as a weapon, relying on maneuver, smoke, and aggressive flanking to offset technical disadvantages. The battalion's first major action came near Morvelles-Vic, where German forces fortified villages with concealed anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams, and mined approaches. The 761st advanced and coordinated platoon wedges, using infantry riding on hulls and turrets to detect ambush sites. As shells impacted around them, the tank commanders practiced rapid target switching, calling out coordinates through intercom systems that were constantly disrupted by shock vibration. Their actions forced German units to withdraw, but the cost was immediate. Several Shermans burned, and casualties mounted among the exposed infantry. Despite this, the battalion pressed forward, demonstrating to the Third Army's corps commanders that they were not merely adequate, they were essential. When the push toward the Saar River began, operational tempo increased. The 761st frequently received orders to advance farther and faster than supporting units, exploiting breakthroughs and sealing weak points before German reserves could counterattack. In these operations, the battalion demonstrated a combination of speed and discipline that altered planning assumptions. Reports from the field noted that their response times were among the fastest in the corps. Patton, reviewing these reports, remarked that he wanted the battalion used without hesitation. This endorsement did not erase segregation, but it changed the way higher command assessed their capabilities. By late autumn, the battalion was operating in near-continuous combat. Crews slept inside their tanks, taking turns resting as engines idled. To prevent freezing, frozen steel magnified the concussive force of incoming shells, and optical equipment frequently frosted over, requiring constant cleaning. Despite these conditions, the 761st adapted to the harsh environment more effectively than many experienced armored units. Their gunners became skilled at snap-fire engagement, striking fleeting German silhouettes before they could reposition. Their drivers maneuvered Shermans through narrow forest trails and ruined villages, using rubble for defilade and deception. Their commanders learned to anticipate German movements, identifying where Panthers would attempt crossfire traps and where infantry would establish Panzerfaust corridors. As winter approached, logistical strain intensified. Fuel shortages threatened armored movement across the entire Third Army, and spare parts arrived unpredictably. The 761st compensated by cannibalizing damaged Shermans, tripping transmissions, boogie wheels, and turret motors from hulls to damaged to repair. Crews became mechanics as much as tankers, working through the night under blackout discipline, guided only by red flashlights and the faint glow of heated tools. These improvisations allowed the battalion to maintain more operational tanks than expected, enabling them to remain in the frontline rotation without relief. Their actions did not go unnoticed by frontline commanders. Reports emphasized their reliability under pressure and their refusal to abandon objectives even when supporting units had withdrawn. In several engagements, platoons from the 761st held critical junctions alone, delaying German advances long enough for infantry or artillery to reposition. Such actions were often omitted from public accounts but were recorded in after-action journals and divisional logs that revealed the battalion's indispensable contribution to the European campaign. The men of the 761st understood that each engagement carried a dual weight, the responsibility to defeat the enemy and the responsibility to prove, through performance, that their exclusion from combat had always been unjust. This awareness hardened their resolve. They fought not only for ground but for recognition, equality, and the right to be judged by competence instead of prejudice. In the smoke and steel of the European battlefields, they carved that recognition out of fire, advancing town by town, road by road, improving with each mile that their courage needed no permission. The 761st Tank Battalion moved into eastern France as autumn turned to a freezing mud-choked winter. Roads collapsed under the rain, fields became swamps, and every forward movement required towing, winching, or brute force grinding. Yet the Black Panthers advanced faster than many veteran armored units. Their Shermans clawed through villages reduced to skeletons of stone, pushed across river crossings under fire, and battered German roadblocks built around anti-tank guns hidden in barns and basements. Reports from the 13th Corps noted that whenever the Panthers were assigned a sector, the line moved out in November 1944, near Morvelesvik. The battalion faced a fortified German ridge supported by machine gun nests, mortar positions, and concealed armor. Panther tanks, the German kind, not the battalion's emblem, shelled the approaches. The 761st pressed forward anyway, maneuvering across narrow farm lanes, while infantry from the 80th Division followed behind. Several Shermans were knocked out, their hulls burning in the mud. But the battalion maintained formation and continued firing until the German defensive line fractured. That breakthrough enabled the corps to roll eastward and close the gap toward the Saar. The Germans did not underestimate them again. As the battalion advanced, enemy radio intercepts began identifying the black tankers as an elite threat. Units were instructed to target their vehicles first. In response, the 761st grew even more methodical. Crews developed fast reaction drills, a loader keeping 2 rounds ready at all times, a gunner pre-traversing 2 likely ambush angles, a driver maintaining torque for sudden acceleration. These refinements, learned under fire, allowed the battalion to survive repeated ambushes from Panzerfaust teams concealed inside ruined houses. By December, the battalion was operating near the German frontier when Hitler launched a sudden counteroffensive through the Ardennes. Battle of the Bulge. Patton, already planning a southeast drive, was ordered to pivot north and relieve the besieged town of Bass. This maneuver required moving an entire army across snow-slicked roads in record time. Among the units chosen to spearhead the relief, the 761st Tank Battalion, despite exhaustion, they formed up and executed a night march under blackout conditions. Driving through sleet and freezing fog, the battalion entered the fight near a key junction blocking the approach to Bass. German grenadiers, paratroopers, and anti-tank detachments had turned the woods into a maze of fire pockets. Visibility dropped to a few dozen meters. Ice covered every surface. Yet the Panthers advanced, their engines roaring against the cold, their guns firing point-blank into tree lines where muzzle flashes flickered. Infantry nicknamed their Shermans snowballs for the way they shoved aside drifts and pushed through churned ice. Progress was brutal but steady. A company seized a crossroads after a 2-hour duel with self-propelled guns. B Company supported a flanking maneuver that broke a German defensive pocket. C Companies, Shermans, coated in frost and camouflage nets, rolled through the final belt of resistance and opened the route toward Bath. When the corridor widened enough for supply convoys to pass, the siege effectively broke. Patton's relief succeeded in part because the 761st refused to yield the frozen ground before them. In January 9, the battalion resumed offensive operations into Belgium and Luxembourg. German formations, worn down by the failure in the Ardennes, began withdrawing toward the Siegfried Line. The Panthers pursued them relentlessly, taking towns one by one, their tanks often arriving before German demolition teams could destroy bridges. They crossed mine-laced approaches, neutralized anti-tank obstacles, and pressed into fortified streets, where every intersection concealed a threat. Even so, the battalion continued to deliver results far out of proportion to its size. As winter gave way to a brittle early spring, the 761st reached the German border. Concrete dragon's teeth pillboxes and layered trench systems marked the outer defenses of the Siegfried Line. Engineers cleared lanes while the Panthers fired continuously to suppress German strength. Once breaches opened, the battalion advanced through shattered defenses and entered Germany itself. Villages burned, artillery thundered overhead, and the battalion maintained pressure despite limited sleep and constant mechanical strain. Morale within the 761st was a mixture of pride and quiet intensity. Crews cleaned their guns with ritual precision, shared rations in the mud beside their tanks, and patched armor with scavenged steel plates. Letters home spoke little of hardship, focusing instead on the drive to finish the job. Officers noted that the battalion's discipline remained exceptional despite relentless operations. Their motto, "Come Out Fighting," had shifted from a slogan to a daily reality. Throughout March, the battalion joined armored thrusts, moving deeper into Germany. Bridges were seized before demolition charges could be fired. Roadblocks were crushed under coordinated tank infantry assaults. German units, worn and fragmented, attempted delaying actions but rarely held for long. The 761st maintained momentum, advancing through towns where resistance flickered and died in minutes. After months of continuous combat, they had become one of the most seasoned armored formations in the theater. By April, the battalion approached the heart of collapsing Germany. Fields once quiet were now battle corridors. Refugees filled the roads. Scattered German detachments counterattacked with Panzerfausts or concealed machine guns. But the Panthers neutralized each threat with practiced efficiency. Their Shermans, scarred by hits and marked by field repairs, rolled forward toward the war's final objectives. The battalion was no longer simply proving its worth. It was shaping the last phase of the European war. The 761st Tank Battalion, forged in segregation and tested in ceaseless combat, had become an indispensable armored spearhead. Their presence was requested by commanders who once doubted their ability to serve. Through the mud of France, the snow of Belgium, and the fortifications of Germany, the Black Panthers carved a record of achievement unmatched by any other segregated armored unit in the U.S. Army. Their next action's final assaults, liberation, missions, and the closing chapter of the war would secure their legacy. The battalion entered Germany with a hardened rhythm that only months of continuous combat could forge. Town after town fell under their advance as they broke through the Siegfried Line's dragon's teeth obstacles, moved through forested ridges, and fought in ruined industrial zones where every basement hid a machine gun team and every street corner held an ambush. The men of the 761st no longer measured progress by miles but by smashed fortifications, captured crossroads, and the number of times their engines were still running after a day of strikes and counters. Their Shermans, dented and scorched, carried the memory of each engagement in cracked armor plates and welded repairs. Crews swapped positions with a fluidity born of necessity. Half the time, the tank commander became the gunner, the driver became the loader, and the loader picked up the radio when incoming fire severed external lines. They adapted because adaptation was survival. In the final push toward the heart of Germany, the battalion operated in a constant state of movement. Roads were cratered, bridges blown, and villages still held by remnants of Volkssturm SS units determined to delay the inevitable collapse. The 761st led armored columns that forced crossings under artillery fire, pushed through choke points where anti-tank guns were concealed behind collapsed buildings, and engaged Panthers and Jag Panthers in close-range duels where reaction and precision mattered more than armor thickness. The Shermans, outclassed on paper, made up the difference in speed and coordinated fire. Their gunners learned to shoot first, shoot accurately, and relocate before German crews could return fire. These final weeks were a test of endurance rather than maneuver. An unbroken chain of engagements where the battalion's skill, discipline, and cohesion overcame the mechanical and tactical disparity. Approaching the Danube, the battalion acted as both spearhead and shield. They seized bridgeheads, held open corridors for infantry divisions, and blocked German attempts to mount local counter-offensives. Intelligence reports described scattered enemy formations attempting to regroup, but the reality was more chaotic. Pockets of resistance mixed with retreating convoys, desperate counterattacks launched without coordination, and civilians fleeing in every direction. Through this confusion, the 761st maintained formation. They kept their intervals tight enough for mutual support, but wide enough to avoid presenting a clustered target to roving German artillery. Their movements resembled a moving wall of steel and determination, a formation that beat its way across the collapsing front. As Germany's defenses fractured, the battalion entered towns where civilians emerged from cellars in silence, watching the American armor pass with equal parts fear and relief. The 761st maintained strict discipline. They patrolled streets, cleared weapons caches, disarmed isolated nests of resistance, and secured intersections for incoming units. Their reputation traveled ahead of them both for efficiency in combat and for conduct in occupation zones. Commanders recognized their reliability, assigning them missions that required steadiness under pressure. The battalion carried out these tasks with the same professionalism they had shown since their first day in Lorraine. In the war's final month, the battalion encountered scenes that marked a shift from combat to liberation. One such moment came when their lead elements reached the vicinity of Gunskirchen, part of the Mauthausen system. Smoke hung over the tree line, and the smell reached them before the sight did. The camp held thousands of starving prisoners, victims of neglect and cruelty as the SS guards abandoned their posts. The 761st secured the perimeter, provided immediate aid with what medical supplies they carried, and called for emergency support from rear echelons. For men who had spent months in tank hatches, insulated from much of the war's human toll by steel and distance, the experience seared itself into memory. Veterans later recalled that nothing they had seen in combat prepared them for the suffering within those fences. The battalion's role shifted again from armored spearhead to liberators. With Germany's surrender approaching, the 761st moved into stabilization duties, securing supply routes, patrolling wide areas to disarm remaining formations, and controlling displaced populations. Their tanks, once instruments of breakthrough, now served as symbols of order in a landscape shattered by years of war. Even in these final days, they maintained readiness. Ambushes from isolated SS groups still occurred, Mines remained buried under shattered pavement, and stray artillery shells periodically landed without warning. But the battalion's discipline never wavered. They ended the war as they had fought it, focused, coordinated, and fully committed to their mission. When the fighting finally stopped, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion looked back on a campaign that had carried them across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. They had breached fortified lines, broken armored counterattacks, covered infantry breakthroughs, and proved their ability in every assignment they were given. Their record spoke for itself. Hundreds of miles advanced, dozens of towns liberated, major operations supported, and enemy formations shattered. They received a Presidential Unit Citation, individual Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and countless commendations from commanders who had witnessed their performance firsthand. Yet recognition came slowly, segregation persisted, and much of their achievement remained overshadowed at the war's end. Only decades later did the full weight of their contribution enter the historical record. Historians reevaluated battle reports, commanders' diaries, and after-action summaries, revealing the battalion's decisive role in operations once attributed solely to other units. Veterans who had long carried their memories in silence were invited to speak, interviewed for documentaries, and honored in ceremonies that acknowledged both their battlefield valor and the burden under which they fought. The 761st had battled not only the but also the prejudice of the Iriette. They emerged with a record that withstood every scrutiny. Their legacy endures as a testament to determination under adversity. They demonstrated that excellence is not granted but forged, in training grounds where expectations were low, in tank holes filled with diesel fumes, across frozen ridges under incoming fire, and on roads where every mile demanded another test of will. They proved that courage is not a temporary surge but a sustained force, carried through months of combat by discipline and unity. In the story of the Second World War, the Black Panthers stand as a formation that rose above the constraints of their time. When peace came, the battalion's veterans returned to a country that had yet to fully accept them. Some continued military careers, others entered civilian life, but all carried the memory of what they had accomplished together. Their emblem, a Black Panther ready to strike, became a symbol of resilience. Today their legacy is studied in military academies, cited in discussions of armored warfare, and honored in museums dedicated to the war they helped win. The Black Panthers did not ask for easy missions. They took the ones they were given and pushed through every obstacle. Fortified lines, enemy armor, winter storms, shortages. Partisan end reached the end of the war with a record matched by few units of any race or background. Their journey stands as one of the most compelling chapters in armored history. Their service remains a clear lesson. When disciplined soldiers are given the opportunity to prove themselves, they carry the mission farther than anyone expects.